Ever feel like you're the one who's a little off, Especially at church. Like when life gets messy and you look around and it seems like everyone else has it all together.
Yeah, you're definitely not alone in feeling that way.
Yeah.
And that's really what Ortlund and Alberry are getting at in You're Not Crazy, Gospel Sanity for Weary Churches.
Gospel sanity. I love that.
Yeah.
It's like they're tossing a lifeline to those of us who feel like we're going under a little bit.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's Ortlund, Andy, Allberry, two guys, two voices I really respect, makes me even more interested to jump in.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you get that blend. You get Ortlund's pastoral heart, and then you get Alberry's theological, I don't know, sharpness.
Yeah.
And so it makes for a really good read.
So walk us through it a little bit. What's the core issue that they're tackling in this book?
Yeah, so they kind of dive straight into this idea that a church can have really good doctrine, like check all the boxes theologically, but still have a culture that's, I don't know, just off.
Off in what way?
Yeah, like almost even toxic.
Yeah.
And they're saying that it's possible to live in a way that actually denies the faith.
Ooh.
Even while we're affirming, kind of intellectually, we're like, yes, I believe all of that.
Right.
But then the way that we live is actually a denial of the faith.
Interesting. It's like that saying, you can't judge a book by its cover.
Yes.
But this is like, you can't judge a church by its statement of faith.
Exactly. And so they actually use the example, I think it's 1 Timothy 5, where it talks about caring for widows. And it says, if anyone doesn't provide for their relatives, and especially for members of their household, they've denied the faith and are worse than an unbeliever. And so they're saying, okay, so you can say you believe all the right things.
Right.
But if you're not caring for the orphan and the widow, which is kind of this picture of the vulnerable, right?
Right.
Then you're actually denying the faith.
So it's not just about intellectual assent. It's about our actions lining up, right, living it out.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And they even compare it to the Pharisee in Luke 18. You remember he's like boasting about all these good things he does and he's looking down on everybody else. And they're saying, that true gospel transformation should actually make us more welcoming,
Or open.
more accepting, not judgmental and exclusive.
It's so easy to fall into that trap, though, to be like, well, our doctrine's right, so we're good.
Yes.
It's like you're saying, hold on, let's see how you're treating other people.
Exactly. That's that self-justification thing.
Yeah.
Where you're so focused on appearing righteous
Right. Yeah.
that you miss the heart of what it means to really follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And so that leads into this idea of radical welcome,
Okay.
which I think is where this book gets really challenging for a lot of our maybe typical church cultures.
Yeah. When you say radical welcome, what comes to mind for you?
So they tell this illustration, and it's actually from The West Wing, the TV show, but it's this idea of how these small little interactions, like way up at the top, like policy decisions being made,
Right.
have these huge ripple effects.
Yeah.
And they're saying that's the same way in the church. Just the smallest act of welcome, or the opposite, right? The tiniest, hint of judgment
Sure.
can totally change how somebody experiences church.
It's like you walk in and you can just tell,
Yes.
whether it's okay to be you or if you've got to put on this front.
Absolutely. And they would say true gospel welcome should reflect the way that Christ welcomes us. Unconditional, no pretense. There's no got to clean yourself up before you come to Jesus.
Right.
And I think about the woman at the well in John 4. She's got all this baggage,
Yeah.
ostracized by her community. And Jesus meets her there
It's so good.
and offers her living water.
And the leper in Mark 1.
Yes.
Like he touches him. He doesn't shy away. He reaches out and touches him. It's so good.
It's countercultural.
So countercultural. Yeah.
Yeah.
What would that look like
Right.
for the church to be that today?
And, speaking of challenging norms, one of the things I love about Ortlund and Alberry is how they address this whole thing about honesty in the church. And they have this whole thing about how in the early church, believers would actually confess their sins openly. And get this, it actually attracted people to the faith.
It does seem so counterintuitive in our world today, right?
Yes.
Where it's all about, Instagram and projecting this image of perfection.
Yes. Yeah.
You've traded the confessional booth for the curated feed.
That's really good.
Yeah.
It really is, yeah. And, they would say that when a church reflects what Jonathan Edwards called this happifying light,
Have fun.
this radiant joy and holiness of God's presence, that it actually makes people feel safe enough to be real.
It's that sense of belonging, right?
Yes.
You don't have to have it all together.
You're accepted. You're already accepted. And that's not because of what you do. It's not because you have it all together,
Right.
but because of who you are in Christ.
Yeah. So good.
And so they get into 1 John 1, verses 5 through 10, where John's talking about walking in the light and confessing our sins. And that creates this safe space for vulnerability,
So good.
which is essential for authentic community.
Right.
But then they take it a step further, and this is where it gets even more challenging, I think, this idea of honor.
Okay, so it's one thing to be honest about our struggles and our junk,
Right.
but to actually be honored and celebrated for who we are, that's different.
Yes, and they would say that it's about actively looking for the good in others and then affirming it. And they give the example of David in Psalm 16.3, where he's calling his fellow believers the excellent ones,
Oh, wow.
and he finds delight in them. So what if we viewed each other that way?
It's so much easier to focus on flaws, though, right?
Right.
In ourselves and in other people.
Totally. Like, that's our default. But seeing each other first through the lens of grace,
Yeah.
recognizing that potential for future glory that God sees in us. There's this great C.S. Lewis quote. He says, "It may be that the souls whom we think worst of, both living and dead, stand in a higher place than ourselves, and that we shall know this to our humbling."
Oh.
Right? Isn't that good? It just levels us.
So we're talking about grace, radical welcome, honesty, honor. Where do they go from there?
So then they kind of take those principles and apply them to these practical areas of church life, like preaching and leadership.
Okay.
And, oh man, their section on preaching, it's funny, but it's also really insightful.
It is. Like, it's one of my favorite sections. So I'm like, ooh, I've been in that service.
Totally, yeah. It's so easy to get caught up in performance, trying to preach that killer sermon.
Yeah, like how many points can I hit? How
Yeah.
much information can I download?
Yes, and they remind us that the goal isn't to showcase our own eloquence or whatever. It's to point people to the eloquence and the brilliance of Christ.
Right. And that takes the pressure off, too,
Yes,
because it's not ultimately about us.
exactly. They say when preaching is done right, it's actually Christ preaching Christ through us.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, okay, less pressure on me.
Yes. But then, of course, there's the whole leadership aspect of the church,
Yes.
which can be tricky.
It can be a minefield, can't it?
Yes, it can.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key takeaways they give us there?
So one of the examples they use to illustrate how worldly leadership can creep into the church is this anecdote about a pastor who used squash, like the sport, as this power play with his staff.
I've got to hear more about this squash situation. This
Yeah.
sounds intense.
It's so good. So apparently this pastor was like an avid squash player,
Okay.
and he would challenge staff members to matches
Oh, no.
as a way to kind of assert his dominance.
Oh, my goodness. Like, I'm picturing this whole, it's like a sitcom.
It is.
But I can also see how that kind of dynamic would be so damaging.
Yes. So they're contrasting that with the biblical model of leadership that we see, 1 Samuel 8, Ezekiel 34, where God condemns those leaders who exploit and abuse their power rather than shepherding their flock.
Right. It's lording it over versus leading with service and gentleness.
Yes.
I think it's Mark 10 where Jesus talks about that.
Yes, and they even reference 1 Peter 5, where Peter warns these elders. He's like, don't be domineering over those in your care.
It's about empowering and equipping, not controlling and manipulating,
Yes.
which leads us to, I think, ultimately, their point about love being more than words,
Yes.
more than just going through the motions. It's about cultivating this deep, abiding love that actually transforms how we relate to each other.
And they even point out how easy it is for Christian language to become cliche.
Yeah.
And they tell this funny story about overhearing a conversation, and it's very clear these people don't even like each other, but they're like, love you, bye.
Love you, bye.
And they're like, I don't even like you.
Exactly. It's like, wait a second. That's just, it means nothing.
Just habit.
And so we've got to check our hearts, make sure our words are backed up by our actions.
Yeah.
They take us back to John 13:35. Jesus says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another.
It's about more than just a feeling.
Right.
It's a choice.
Right.
It's that I'm going to choose to love you even when it's difficult.
Even when you're being difficult. Yeah.
Exactly.
I do love how they emphasize that it's not about, building this perfect church.
Right. Like, we're not aiming for the Instagram-worthy church culture. It's much more about the journey. It's the process of becoming more like Christ together.
We're all a little messed up, right?
Yeah. Saintly sinners is how they put it.
Yeah, that's good.
Which I love because it means we're all in this together,
Nah.
figuring it out as we go.
And one thing I really appreciate, especially when I got to the acknowledgments, was Ortlund and Alberry admitting that, hey, their work's in progress too. It just makes it so much more real.
It does. It makes you realize we're not striving for some unattainable ideal. We're just all on this journey together pursuing this gospel sanity.
Yeah. They end on such an interesting note, though. Do you remember that part where they talk about the church being like this cosmic act of defiance against the devil?
Oh, yeah. They bring in Ephesians 3:10, where Paul talks about how the church is actually putting God's wisdom on display, like showcasing it to these spiritual powers and principalities in the heavenly realms.
Yeah. It's wild when you think about it like that.
It really is. And Ortlund and Alberry suggest that when we have a church that is healthy, that is vibrant, that is characterized by genuine love, that is one of the most powerful ways to stand against the forces of darkness.
Like shining a light,
Yeah.
in the darkness.
Exactly. It's saying this is what's possible. This is what happens when grace and love are given space to work.
Yeah, so good. And it really makes you think about what the church is here for.
Right. It does. It's not just about us. It's not even just about creating this little safe bubble for ourselves. We're called to be a beacon of hope to the world.
Absolutely. To show that there's a different way to live, it's such a powerful reminder for all of us, no matter where we're at in our own faith journeys.
It really is.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today, but if you're listening, here's something I want you to think about this week. What would it look like for your church to be that radically welcoming community that Ortlund and Alberry describe? How can you, in your own way, help create that space where honesty and honor can flourish? And how might that become a source of light in the world around you? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.